Tonight, I'm very pleased to welcome a group of very passionate and people from diverse backgrounds who are working toward the same goal, which is to eliminate lost fishing gear or ghost gear from our ocean. So please help me in welcoming Kurt Lieber, Dick Ogg, Kirsten Gillardi, and David Stover. So I'm going to turn it to you, Dick, to start us off, just to give us a little background on who you are and why you're here.
My name is Dick Ogg, and I'm a commercial fisherman in Bodega Bay. I have a fishing vessel by the name of Karen Jean, and we fish for salmon, crab, albacore, and black cod.
My name's David Stover. I'm a co-founder of Biryeo. We started a project about 6 years ago to collect discarded fishing nets from fishermen, primarily in South America right now, and we turn that material into a raw material for companies to make products out of.
I'm Kurt Lieber, president and founder of Ocean Defenders Alliance. I've been removing abandoned commercial gift fishing gear since 2000, and we're a nonprofit here located in Southern California.
Kirsten Gillardi. I'm a wildlife veterinarian. I work up at UC Davis, and I started the California Lost Fishing Gear Recovery Project about 12 years ago. Work with commercial fishermen to recover gear out of the coastal ocean here in California.
Great. So thank you very much for joining us. So we need to start out with the question of what is ghost gear. Some of you may have heard the term ghost gear. Some of you may have heard derelict gear or lost fishing gear. So Kirsten, can you give us a little background on what that is? What does that mean?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It gets called a number of different things. Ghost fishing gear seems to be the term that is used kind of around the world to refer to fishing gear, whether it's fishing gear that's been put in the ocean by fishermen who make their living from fishing, to recreational folks who are fishing just for the sheer joy of it. It's gear that's is no longer being deployed for the purpose of fishing. So it's either been abandoned, it's been intentionally discarded, thrown away into the ocean. It's been lost, and there are a lot of reasons for why and how gear gets lost in the ocean. So it's technically just a catch-all term for fishing gear that is really not being actively used by a fisher, no matter what kind of gear it is or where the fisher is working in the world.
And why does that matter?
Why do
we need to remove ghost gear?
So I think we're all passionate about this subject because many of you are probably here tonight because you care about the ocean. You may or may not have been following really what's kind of a groundswell of momentum around the world for the problem of debris in the ocean. Stuff that we as humans have allowed to get into the ocean, and it doesn't belong there. Fishing gear is one form of marine debris. As people who are enthusiastic about wildlife and care about conservation and about a pristine ocean, fishing gear, and whether it's ghost fishing gear or whatever you want to call it, it does have an impact on the ocean, whether it's entangling or entrapping marine life, in some cases actually affecting the fish that the fishermen themselves would like to be able to have the chance to harvest for their own livelihoods. It entraps and entangles marine life. It alters habitat, so you can imagine. And if you've been here today, you've seen many, many tanks and exhibits that really give you such a wonderful picture of what the ocean looks like underwater, and the rocky reef habitats. And if you can imagine one of those rocky reefs that's kind of covered in a big purse seine net or something, that's permanently altered that reef, and that reef is complex and is the home for millions of organisms. So ghost fishing gear has impacts on multiple different levels. It's not just about its impacts to marine life. It's also habitat, but it's also impacts fishermen themselves. So Dick will be able to talk about the fact that losing gear is a hardship for fishermen themselves. It costs them a lot of money. It costs a lot in lost opportunity. So
that's a great segue. So Dick, we're going to put you on the spot as our fisherman representative, no pressure. So can you talk a little bit about, as Kirsten was saying, how does it impact fishermen? How does gear get lost in the first place? And how does it impact you guys?
I'd have to speak primarily about the crab fishing industry. Our gear gets lost based on weather conditions, tidal movements. The buoys themselves can go underwater. The currents can drive them down. We can't find them. We continually move our gear as we pick it up. It moves from point A to point B and across and back and forth. So we have a tendency to miss a pot now and again, or it gets dragged away by debris, and it's an expensive loss. I mean, each pot that we lose is about $250. And so over time, that can be pretty, expensive. It's also something that we're concerned about in terms of vertical lines, and we don't want additional vertical lines in the water to potentially entangle other animals. So it's something that we are definitely concerned about, and we're working to recover as much as we can.
So can you give us some examples of what the fishermen are doing to recover the gear?
When the season is over and we're allowed to go back and pick up the additional gear, we typically will go out, find lost pots, bring them in, and bring them back to the dock. Now, ask that question again, please.
Some examples of what you guys are doing to recover the gear.
To recover the gear, it's a voluntary thing right now, and we basically go out on our own and pick up stray pots that we see and are notified by other individuals where these pots are and where we're able to pick them up, and so we go pick them up and we bring them back.
And so that ties into, so we're looking at some of the solutions, and one of the solutions is removal, and that's what you guys are doing, and that's something you guys started working on with Kirsten, right?
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit more about that project that you did with the fishermen, that you're continuously working on with the fishermen?
Right. I think that was probably about 5 or 6 years ago that we started this. Kirsten came and helped us promote that pot recovery program. There was funds available to help develop a program with our association where we paid individuals to bring these pots back, and then the pots were then sold back to the fishermen themselves. So it's kind of, it was a monetary gain for the guys that didn't have an opportunity to, say, fish salmon in the off season, and it was a way to help promote them, financially when they didn't have any other fisheries to go to.
And do you want to add to that, Kristen?
I think so. When I first approached Dick and his fellow fishermen at Bodega Bay, we were coming into that after spending many years, primarily down here in the Southern California ocean, using grant funds to hire commercial fishermen to get in the water. These are urchin harvesters, so they make their living on gear, dive gear, really, really great at working underwater for many hours. And so we'd hire them to recover nets and a lot of lobster traps. With that effort, which included a lot of going out and finding funding to make that happen, pulled over 120 tons of gear out of the water so far. Have also had, these guys have pulled a lot of toilets and tires out of the water too, but that's a different story. But I think the motivation from our end was, they're clearly, the fishermen themselves are doing the work. We're making it possible, but they're doing the work. And wouldn't it be nice to develop a system that could start paying for itself? Because to be honest, it can be sort of tiring writing grant proposals all the time, as Kurt knows. He's nodding his head. So thought, is there a way to start making this a little bit more financially sustainable? And why shouldn't the fishermen themselves be, earning the money, making the money for gear recovery? And so that's when we approached Dick, and with some funding from NOAA, from the federal government, we're able to create a program where we were able to subaward some funds to his Fishermen's Association. They used those funds to pay people like Dick to bring in Dungeness crab pots that were still in the ocean after the season. And then the association itself sold those traps back to the original owner. And in that way, we kind of made it into something a little bit more financially sustainable. And what's very cool is our motivation to try to make that a little bit more financially sustainable turned into an effort by the fishermen themselves to propose legislation to make it a permanent program. So now it's actually written into Department of Fish and Game Code that there will be a Dungeness crab gear retrieval program that's mandated by the state by law and will facilitate fishermen like Dick and his colleagues to recover gear legally and to do that, without it costing an arm and a leg to be out there in the water. That's a terrible term to use for fishermen.
One more thing about that too. This isn't something that we didn't do before. It's always been important to us, and we've for years brought the gear back for other fishermen. Everybody wants to help each other. It's just that this is an incentive that helps drive us to do a little bit more, to reach out a little bit more, and try a little harder. So it's much appreciated. Kirsten's help has been fantastic.
So, and this is wonderful. So we know that the fishermen are taking a leadership role in helping to recover the gear and take the ghost gear out of the environment. But we also need recruitment in the communities, and that's what Kurt's really been working on and spearheading, is getting the communities involved. So Kurt, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've been doing?
Yeah, well, what I'm doing is slightly different than what Kirsten's doing. I work primarily with the lobster fishery here, and I have permits with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as NOAA, to go into MPAs and different areas where stuff gets dragged to or it finds its way into. But we also go out into local waters with the local dive community to search and find this stuff. So ours is really laborious. We have a 55-foot boat. We have 4 scooters, underwater propulsion vehicles that the divers can use to go out and locate the stuff. So it's really time-consuming, to say the least, dangerous to a degree, but it takes a special skill to do what we're doing. And I just have been fortunate enough to meet a lot of really dedicated divers. There's a couple of them here in the audience that have given up significant parts of their lives to do this. They know how important it is. And when you start talking about the damage this gear does, I mean, what drove me initially was the kelp. That's what I really wanted to see, the kelp come back. And knowing that the lobsters eat the urchins, and the urchins are feeding on the kelp, I thought that, well, we can do two things at one time, or gain two things here at one time. We're helping the lobsters propagate and live longer and bigger, hopefully, as well as they're taking care of the environment by eating the urchins. So that's just kind of a loop about what drives us to do what we're doing.
And can you talk about some of the other community groups that you've been engaging, like divers and other groups?
Well, my history goes back a long way. I started volunteering in 1983 with the Marine Forest Society, which Kirsten and I were talking about a little bit. It was a misguided effort. We were planting tires in the ocean to try to get kelp to attach to it, and it became a nightmare, an absolute disaster, because we didn't have them secured to the ocean floor very well. And when the storms came in, even though the kelp had attached to the tires washed up on the beach, and Kirsten came along with her group, and they cleaned it up. So I'm guilty there. I tried my best.
But you guys go out, though, and you work with divers like Dave here, and they go out and they do outreach with the community, right?
Yeah, we do tons of talks. It's like a couple times a week we're out. In fact, I was just in schools. We're trying to educate the kids, not not just the adults on what's going on, but the younger generation really needs to be aware of what's going on. And our tack there is to show them the beauty of what's going on down here. And so few of these kids get to the beaches. And this is my way of getting them excited about it, showing really good videos and showing them what's in their own backyard.
That's great. That actually came up yesterday in the power of engaging kids about the ocean. So I think that's really wonderful that you guys are doing that. So circling back to Dick, just to talk a little bit. So we talked about some of the efforts that you guys are doing to help to recover the gear. But can you talk a little bit about what fishermen are doing to reduce incidents of lost gear? Are there any best practices that you guys have in play as a community?
One of the things that we're looking at right now, we're working with some gear innovators regarding GPS type buoy systems that will help locate lost gear, and that'd be incredibly advantageous to us, because many times when the gear gets outside of our lines and we lay this gear in a very straight line, that when it gets outside a few hundred yards, we don't see it and it gets lost. If we had these GPS buoys, they would help locate exactly where this lost gear is, and we'd be able to recover it. And that is something that we're working on now to try and get this established and be something that we can use all the time. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's
okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
So what would it take, though, to implement something like that? So who's paying for that? Is that the fishermen that are paying for that? Is that something that you're getting government support for? What would it take for you guys to be able to implement that?
As soon as it's practical, it would be great to have grant funding. I mean, if we could get some kind of support, because it's going to be an additional cost that the fishermen are going to have to burden, and it's already tough enough as it is. So it would be great to have some additional help someplace.
Great, and it's for a good cause. So now David's been quiet over here, so we're going to turn to him. So Biryeo is tackling this from a very different perspective. We kind of heard about the business and economic perspective. So these guys are working in South America with an economic incentive to get fishermen to turn in their old fishing gear. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. We were talking earlier, and I was just listening into the conversation. Obviously, the fishing industry is very dynamic. The types of fish that you're catching, the type of gear that you're using, but there's a parallel to what's going on with all the plastic in the ocean, because there's an issue with waste that's accumulating, and then there's an issue with waste going into the ocean. So there's really a two-pronged approach. One is cleaning up what's out there, and two is helping to prevent more plastic from getting into the ocean. So our programs are primarily focused on the second approach, which is preventing more from getting in. Obviously, with fishing gear, all types of fishing gear, it can be lost. There can be complications with the gear and other reasons why it gets into the water. There is mismanagement, and we see it in South America where the landfills are privatized, so quite expensive to dispose of material. There are not a lot of great options for material at the end of life. It's a burden for a lot of fishermen. And so we started talking to fishermen about collecting those nets back. And now we're actually talking to some of the companies making the fishing gear and proposing that we can incentivize fishermen at the end of life to collect that gear back, so that it doesn't have to go to a landfill, doesn't have to sit in a field, doesn't have to be disposed of. And so our business is primarily working with fisheries to provide an end-of-life incentive in the form of financial incentives to take the old gear back, and then we work with companies to recycle that and put it into products to extend the life. We're well aware that recycling is not the answer to all the world's problems. We need to stop making new things, but for fishing gear, it's a really complex issue, similar to all types of plastic. There's different types of gear. It's made from different materials. And so our project is relatively narrow focused, but we're a small team. But we do see an opportunity to, one, inspire other people to come up with solutions for gear, inspire the fishing net manufacturers to make the gear differently. And that's kind of our core focus right now.
So can you talk a little bit more about those end products that you're turning these nets into? What kind of fun things are you making?
Yeah, so our first idea was to make a skateboard. And one of the co-founders in the team, he actually has experience as an industrial designer and engineer. So we started out as really a skateboard company. We were primarily designing skateboards to be made from fishing nets, and relatively niche product. And an interesting dilemma was that we found that we calculated that even if we made every skateboard that's ever made in 1 year for the whole entire world out of nets, we wouldn't be able to use the amount of nets that we were collecting every year in South America. So that quickly realized that the mission was really focused on keeping nets out of the ocean. So if we were going to accomplish that, we needed to work with companies that use much larger amounts of material. And so our focus now is to help bigger companies that have to rely on these materials, give them an option to use a recycled source. So anything from an office chair that you sit in, we're looking at some car parts, we're looking at outdoor gear, where companies can be given an option to not use new plastic, which does fuel fossil fuel exploration, has other impacts with emissions, but you can use a reclaimed source, and then the added benefit is that you're helping fisheries through incentives and end-of-life solutions for the gear.
And is the recycled gear then an economic benefit for those businesses? It's going to be cheaper than the newer?
It's still developing. We call it an immature commodity. Certainly the work that Kirsten and Kurt and Dick are working on, the actual recovery is extremely expensive. So if you were looking at a per kilogram basis of that work and looking to start a business, very, very challenging. So, and the same is for working in the ports. So with any recycling program, you're up against transportation costs, logistics, cleaning. So right now the source of the material is at a premium, but it's put into products where consumers are recognizing the value, the social and environmental value of that material. And there is the market is showing that there is demand that can support those programs.
That's great. And that's really promising to hear. So there have been studies on that, because I know with like seafood certifications, the recognition rate is actually relatively low. So it's always promising to hear that there are people willing to pay that price premium for those good products. So I guess the question now is, you have a public here, you have a public that's online, and the question is, you guys are doing all of this great work. So what is it that you want these guys to take away with them? What do you want them to know about this issue, or about what you're doing, or about all of the above?
Well, I guess a couple takeaways I hope you'll take away from this evening is, one, I do feel very strongly that while maybe some of us tend to want to point fingers at different actors in this sort of global problem, I think really it's the fishermen and the fishing industry and the seafood industry and other industries that have both the opportunity, the responsibility, but also there's a lot of will to do something about this. So I think that when it comes to ghost fishing gear, I think it's essential that fishermen are involved, whether they're commercial fishermen or recreational fishermen, because I think there's a lot of, first of all, knowledge and experience there, but also a lot of will and passion to be a part of the solution. I'm really heartened also by this, as I mentioned earlier, what seems to be some momentum growing around the issue of debris in the ocean, and not just ghost fishing gear. Ghost fishing gear is a big part of it, but overall a big drive to do something about pollution, plastic pollution, other forms of debris going into the ocean, either from land or from the sea. And even the United Nations is now involved in investing resources, time, and people, and to addressing sources of marine debris for the ocean, including fishing gear. So I'm really heartened by that, because I think maybe if some of these major international efforts can bring those kinds of resources and all that sort of brain power to bear upon the problem, we may see some big shifts finally in some of the policies that are applied, but also maybe a shift in philosophy that's not just, you're here because you're ocean enthusiasts who love the aquarium and you're interested in this topic. But I think that as some of these big international organizations start to put some effort into this problem, we're going to see some change. I'm really heartened by that.
I would a couple points. I mean, one, I think sharing knowledge, like everyone in the room has learned from all the voices up here. I think sharing that with your peers is always helpful. I mean, from our side, I'd say the number one thing we've learned is conscious consuming. So understand where the food you're eating is coming from, where the products that you're buying are coming from, and trying to make responsible decisions where it is economically possible. And I think that is, as consumers, even individual consumers, we don't realize how much power we have. Businesses constantly look at us and our habits and the way that we buy products and the way that we make decisions. And as we shift the way we do that and we put demands on bigger companies to make products more responsibly, to worry about waste streams, to worry about impacts, then those companies shift. And specifically, I'd say on the fishing gear issue, obviously also paying attention to local initiatives, trying to purchase seafood locally. I think in my personal opinion, I'll let Dick comment on that. And that's a really great way to support local fisheries. And then just being aware, paying attention to the issues and where you can help support organizations doing work to clean up, or even something as simple as going to a beach cleanup and helping to remove some debris. I think we can all get involved.
If I had anything to hope that you go home with, is to realize that we as a commercial fishing industry are really the true stewards of the ocean. I mean, we really care about making sure that we don't want to damage the products that we're bringing to you. We want to make sure that we're trying to take care and making sure that we bring the stuff back and we don't leave garbage in the water, and we try to be as sustainable as possible with our techniques and everything. So I just would like for you to believe in us and realize that we're trying our best to bring a sustainable organic product to the public.
Well, Dick represents the really bright side of the fishing industry. I've been involved in this for decades, and the international community does not have near the awareness nor care, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I'm seeing, and I don't want to name countries, but you guys probably already know who they are, they have vast fleets of these mega ships out there that are not doing things sustainably. They're vacuuming up the oceans. They're leaving their nets in the water when they can't discard of them because they're out at sea, and they're washing up all over the world. I do a lot of work in Hawaii right now, and there's a place called South Point on Kona, and when it was first discovered there, the nets were piled so high, it was 12 feet tall, and it covered almost 1.5 miles of the beach. And that's just one spot that's, in the Pacific that's washing up with these nets. And I believe it's something like 60% of the marine debris in the ocean right now is made up of nets. So even though Dick and his friends are doing what they can, it's commendable, we have to recognize when you're buying your fish, you have to recognize where it's coming from and what country is catching that stuff. So that's just something I want people to be aware of.
And the U.S. has been widely recognized for having some of the most sustainable fisheries in the world. So that's a plus. So buy U.S. California seafood. Support Dick. So we decided as a group, and we're talking at dinner, and we really want to hear from you guys and open up to questions from you. So I hope you guys have some good questions for the panel. Can we bring up the house lights?
I guess this would mostly be for David. So I'm seeing there's two problems. There's the accidental loss, and then there's the purposeful end of life, just throw it overboard and then go buy new equipment. problem. So you're trying to get the nets at the end of life before they dispose of them. Just throw them into the ocean because it's cheaper. Couldn't there be some sort of the people that sell fishing nets do a trade-in like pop bottles you get a little refund on? Because a lot of these materials they're using now, it's not the old manila biodegradable stuff. There are different proprietary plastics out there, and every net fisherman has a better product than the other net maker. And so the proprietary, so they'd have to go back to that retailer, you might say. And so there's kind of a cycling process with each brand that's out there. Would that be the goal?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely accurate. I mean, as far as the disposal goes, I don't want to make it sound like every gear that's not lost is disposed of in the ocean. Certainly it happens. Primarily what we see in South America, there's a lot of illegal dumping. So the nets might be on a legal landfill site somewhere. They rarely make it to a privatized landfill because it's expensive. So the issue is that it's difficult for the fishermen to work with the nets because it's usually a burden on them to purchase new nets. The old nets could be in bad condition, hard to transport, lack of time. There's a number of things that go into it. But they are purchasing the nets from a relatively few number of net manufacturers in a country. So take Chile for an example. A lot of the nets are actually made locally. So they'd be spun in country. The yarn, which it's made from, you're absolutely right, predominantly nylon, high-density polyethylene, polypropylene. Those are the three primary forms of material, and you can get a variety of color and size and thickness. And we have started to engage with those net manufacturers. There are some leasing models that are happening where the net manufacturers agree to perform service on the nets over a period of time, and they accumulate a lot of waste, so we're talking to those manufacturers. I mean, we see that as a great model, as in the fisheries pay like a constant rate. The nets can be serviced, they can be replaced, and then the old material can go to a recycling program. And then the other model would just be a simple hand in your net at the end of life for an incentive, so basically for cash. But the idea is that for us to have impact, we've proven in 23 or so communities in Chile that fishermen are engaged. Like Dick was saying, they do care about having an environmental point to disposal of their material. And we think there's an opportunity as a global community and a global practice where the people making the material and putting that into practice can be involved in the end of life. And you can really create a circular economy for the gear.
Leasing sounds very interesting.
Can I add just one quick thing to that? Or I think sometimes people have been surprised to hear about our project, at least, that we've actually repatriated the gear back to the fishermen for the most part. So we've done a lot of lobster trap cleanup, as Kurt has mentioned, and every lobster fisherman sort of sets up their trap in a different way. So as fishermen we worked with could really recognize whose trap was whose, and we'd give those traps back to the fishermen. And people would say, "Why are you doing that? They lost them in the first place." Well, they didn't lose them on purpose necessarily, especially down here. There's a lot of buoys get chopped off of lines by passing, sport boats and things. So they were grateful to get them back. They're going to use them. That saves them, money out of pocket that they would have used to go and replace that trap. Built awareness for the program, built a lot of goodwill. So then we could start getting calls from the fishery saying, "Hey, I'm so bummed. I lost 10 traps off of such and such a point last week when that storm came through. If you guys, I'm just letting you know they're out there in case you've got divers in the water. It'd be great to get those out of the water because I can't find them. Because of course there's no buoy at the surface. The fishermen can't pull up the trap, and they just keep fishing, especially if they're baited. Especially if it's a lobster trap. Lobster crabs like to eat dead things, right? So anything that goes in the trap and dies just continues. The trap just continues to fish, really. So we gave a lot of gear back to fishermen.
Yeah, and that's something we were talking about over dinner is that, each of these communities is different. It's like a fingerprint, right? And so you have to approach each issue in each community with different potential solutions. You can't just have a one-size-fits-all. And here you can see that there are different ways to accomplish the same goal. I know we had some other questions out here.
Well, this is a very interesting subject. I had no background whatsoever, and I want to commend you for all the information that you shared today. And this is probably going to be a question initially with one point, but I think there might be several points mixed together. Are there consequences nationally or internationally if people are found dumping the gear? And when you mentioned about finding the gear, I kind of thought about some of the lectures I've seen here at the Aquarium where they tag some of the marine life or they tag the birds. They know which way they migrate. So I was wondering if there's a way to tag them. And when the person purchases the gear, okay, like when you get a driver's license, okay, kind of thing, is there a way to have the gear tagged with the chip so you know exactly who bought it, and perhaps that chip could have a GPS kind of thing in it? Now, I know I kind of asked you a question with 3 parts to it, but my brain got to thinking, so that's what I thought I'd share with you. Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, no, I mean, you are thinking exactly along the right lines, and there's a lot of work being done right now on how to mark gear so that it's identifiable to the fishery that it came from, maybe even to the fisher. And Dick has been working with engineers to develop improvements on the buoys for gear, trap gear, to allow the fishermen to be able to track it if it gets moved by the force of the ocean or by a boat to somewhere else. They can track it. You might want to speak to that. But you're absolutely right that that's a big part of the conversation on what kinds of modifications could we be applying to the gear and in fisheries to make it possible to trace this gear back to its origin fishery. And we're talking about gear that is moving vast distances. I've spent a lot of time in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and my brother-in-law was out on Wake Atoll, doing other kind of work a couple of years ago, and picked up a tag from the California Dungeness crab fishery on the beach on Wake Island. So it gives you a sense for how far this gear moves around. So gear that's lost off of the Southeast Asian coast is washing up in the northern shores of Australia. So. And it's not always easy to tell where the gear is coming from, and if we had that information, then perhaps could be going back and making management recommendations to those fisheries about how not to lose that gear. So it's a great question.
I can comment on the identification aspect of this. We are required to have tags within the pots that have our phone numbers and the fishing vessel on it, so that if the pot is found, we can, then bring it back to the rightful owner. We're also, all our buoys are marked with our license numbers, and they have individual pot tags on them. So the gear itself is identifiable. And typically what we do is, if it is found, or however it's found, we bring it back in, and then we're able to bring it back to the person. So we've thought about, in fact, I think with this GPS system, they've talked about putting chips in those that again would identify the individual. But the tags that are mandated by the state in the pot is something that we've utilized for years to be able to identify the person who has that pot.
I just add one point. Great question. In addition to the tagging, I know another thing that's being talked about globally, and we've sat on some meetings for the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, which is an initiative between industry, environmentalists, companies to talk about solutions. And in addition to tagging, one idea, I believe the scientific term is mass balance, but the idea is that all of the weight coming in goes out. And this idea that you could track and log gear by fishery. And it isn't meant to penalize the fishermen. I think that's really important, is that, and Dick can speak to that, but the idea is that if gear is lost, it's a voluntary acknowledgement of that, and that can be logged, and then organizations working on collection can mark that. We personally, as working in these communities, see that as a very valuable tool to knowing really how much waste there is out there. If you look at all the new gear purchased by fishing ports around around the world, even by boat, if we're able to track and log the amount of gear coming in and coming out, you help the fishermen manage, okay, here's the waste, there's an incentive to get rid of it. If it's lost, then we can report that. And really your goal is that at the end of the year, whatever comes in equals whatever goes out. And okay, maybe there might be some gear lost, some gear is recycled, and they're going to keep fishing with some gear. So it's a really good question.
Yeah, and I think, so one of the key themes you keep hearing here is not to vilify or point fingers, right? And I think not just with this issue, but, in general, we're going to get a lot, what is that old saying? You catch a lot more with honey than you do with vinegar. Trust works both ways, right? So if we keep going after big bad industry or the fishermen saying you're the bad guy, what incentive do they have to come to the table and work as a team? And this global initiative is a good example where you have all these different stakeholder groups working together. And it's really important for us to do just that, to work together and again, having that trust and transparency on all sides of how we work together, not point fingers and blame the other party. I think you had a question up front, did you?
Hello. I just want to thank you again for all the efforts that you're doing. It's really amazing to hear this much work and thought being put into this issue. My question for you, and this is sort of like a general question, is how much of the, let's say, the battle for, pushing forward this era of sustainability and just sort of putting more emphasis on keeping this major pollutant out of the oceans, how much of it is more of a legislative battle versus sort of a more soft kind of diplomacy working with all these various groups?
You want to start?
Wow, I don't think it's not one or the other. It's both, and there's not a one size fits all approach. I think in some cases legislation can work wonders. I spend a lot of time working in East Central Africa on something completely unrelated to ghost fishing gear, and the country where I work, the leader of the country just said we're not going to have plastic bags in our country. No more plastic bags are allowed. In fact, they even tell you on the airplane as you're getting off the airplane, if you have plastic bags, leave them on the airplane because they're not allowed in this country. And as a result, it's an incredibly clean country, and you just have to go to the border to their neighbors, and it's a completely different scene. So in that situation, legislation, or at least rulemaking, policy making, made a huge difference in an entire country. That's in Rwanda. But in other situations, the policy doesn't, lawmakers aren't necessarily pushing the agenda, and it's people who are directly affected by these problems that will make huge change. So I really think the answer is both, but I'm sorry, that's probably not what you're after, but I do think that it takes both, and also takes the community level people to put the pressure on the lawmakers as well, right?
Yeah, and I think, Kirsten, you alluded to this earlier too. It's not one size fits all, and in order to make strong policy that's going to have an impact, you also need more information. And so what you were talking about with marking the buoys, and if you know exactly where it's coming from, you can start to develop policy around that. So you've got that chicken and egg scenario where you need more information before you can create effective policy. So that's not the broad spectrum. There are certainly areas where you could potentially create policy, but it's complicated.
And I think with the fishermen, and I'm sure Kurt's doing the same, and we take a lot of data on what this gear is doing in the ocean. We're counting what's in the traps or caught in the nets. We're counting the amount of seafloor that it's covering. So the fishermen who've been recovering Dungeness crab traps are doing the same. So that all serves to form an evidence base for the impact and helps to justify all the work that we're doing in collaboration with the fleets and with communities.
Yeah, and the more data you have, the better it is, right? Because if you just work off of, not having enough data, you could potentially put too much strain on the fishing community, and then we lose a source of well-managed seafood that will now be imported from elsewhere with who knows what impacts. So there's a really important balance there. Other questions?
I have two parts. What is the lifetime of a net?
I've been told by scientists nylon net is going to be in there for 650 years. Polypropylene.
Not that, I mean the use.
Oh, I'm sorry, use. I don't have an answer to that.
Okay.
Again,
Would you know that answer, Dick? It does. I guess it doesn't really matter. I know the building industry in the state of.
yeah, I have an opinion on that. I guess similar to Kirsten's answer, that like obviously there's a wide range, so it's not going to clarify much. But I mean, there's cases like we were in Indonesia on a project this year and had talked to fisheries that refer to certain nets as single-use nets because the monofilament gill net rips so easily that sometimes they don't make it through one session. And we see that in South America as well. So you have small gear that can last maybe a couple weeks to a couple months, and the larger gear, even if it doesn't tear, rip, or really sustain damage that causes it to be repaired, it does break down in the sun and in the salt water, and so maybe it will last 5 to 7 years potentially in the best conditions. But from what we see, even relatively small fisheries, it's not, when we first approached it, we were wondering how often they have to purchase new nets. Like this was something they waited, at least in South America, for the nets to rip, and then they bought. And now we've kind of see it, a lot of fisheries treat gear more as a consumable. So there's monthly or yearly, depending on how big the fishery is, orders of gear that's coming in. And so that's how we're starting to get a handle on how much waste is being generated. So yeah, I mean, the ocean's a dynamic environment. Fishing is a complicated practice. It's going to depend on, is it drag netting? Is it purse seining? Is it gill netting? I mean, there's a lot of different spectrums there. Certainly traps and lines are differently with buoys as well. But overall, I think you should expect that you have to implement new gear, and so there's waste generated every year in fisheries.
That's crazy. That's just insane. It really magnifies the problem. The second part is the state of California, and I understand that we're dealing with a global community, and so to get global people on board is like, especially with the variances of how involved people are in sustainability, I can't even imagine how difficult. But the state of California, with the building industry, has put the recycling costs on the purchase. And then when you come back to replace whatever it is, you turn your thing in, no charge. But when you purchase whatever it is, the cost for recycling is on it. I don't know if that would work. Do you think that would work? Or is that?
Yeah, I mean, I favor my personal opinion. I think that if you make the financial burden on the fishermen lower, so if you go towards like a leasing model or a way to make the payments go down every year, and you have a way to financially incentivize them to bring back the gear, then they look at the gear at the end of life as money, not as waste. And I think that's the real switch that we need. I mean, it's the same with all plastic, right? I mean, look at if you look at the recycling rates for plastic bottles in communities or counties that have a redemption, then they're really high. If you look at rates in countries or counties where they don't pay a redemption fee to bring it back, then you don't see many bottles. And so I think that practice, similar to your suggestion, it can be effective, but I think specifically for the fishing industry, if we find ways to work with them and financially incentivize them, then the traction and the success will be much higher.
Well, I got to thinking some more, and you mentioned about going into the school with the children who are our future. And I want to find out, when you go to the school with the subject matter, how do you bring it to them? And how are you getting them involved? Because children have minds that are just amazing and so creative. And I want to find out if you have children involved. Because when I think of climate change and I see this 14-year-old on the TV and young people on the TV, and they're so enthusiastic to do something about climate change, are you getting the children involved, and how are you getting them involved nationally and internationally? Because I think that's something that really needs to be done. Thank you.
Well, I'm local here, and what I do here it can't be relayed over the entire planet. But we're a small organization, and what I'm doing is, again, trying to get the kids excited about the oceans. That's my primary thing first. And then I draw them into the damages, the certain aspects like plastics. I cover the whole gamut of things. I'm not just specifically focusing on the fishing industry. Trying to get them aware of what's going on detrimentally in our environment. And then I can't take them out on my boat, but what I can do is we do beach cleanups and harbor cleanups, so I get them involved in that aspect of it. And then that, every time you get them near the water, it generates whole new conversations. And it's just amazing to hear the thoughts that come out of these young people when they see an octopus stuck in a tube. You know, why don't you want me to throw that tube back in the water? It's his home. Well, then you can have the debate or the conversation about it's polluted, it's leaching toxins into their body as they're in there. So education just has a way of resonating with kids for forever, and that's our goal as here as well as in Hawaii, and it's working really well.
All right. One more question? Yeah.
Hello. While I was thinking, I also remembered sort of an interesting phenomenon with plastic is that, at least with plastic pollution, is that it does tend to sort of attract one another. Like we all know of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and the like. I was wondering when you go out and do reclamation work with, I guess in particular nets and like other sorts of equipment, how much other plastic pollution are you also bringing up with that? Like how much have you been like, I feel like this is sort of a double-pronged spear. It's like you can also reuse the nets like in a more of a traditional fishing sense, but you can also potentially use these to collect and gather more plastic pollution. I was just sort of wondering if there were any ideas or any movement on that front.
I'll just answer quickly, and I'm sure Kirsten has some more to add to it, but some people are doing this fishing for plastics, so they're, and I haven't done this yet, but I've been involved with this. This isn't my group. I'm involved with some other organizations that are doing it. They contract with the fishermen to go out about 2 or 3 times a year. This is happening over in North Carolina. And the guys are going out with their fishing nets, and they're being paid, and they have a tournament. They're seeing how much can we pull up. And the interesting thing about that is when they're pulling this plastic up in their nets, they're saying, oh, my word, I threw that in here. You know, they're finding out that it's coming back to them. So it's just one example of what people are doing to try to educate the fishermen, get them to use their boats, and pay them at the same time.
And is that a NOAA marine debris program?
That is not part of the marine
it's
debris.
not part
No,
of the marine
no.
All right. One more. Last question. No pressure, Dave.
So y'all have described a huge spectrum of things that are going on, and it occurred to me, I haven't heard anything about funding. Where are each of you and organizations getting funding to support all of this information or work?
Funding for us has come from, it's primarily been government. It's either been the state of California or it's been the federal funders like NOAA and the Marine Debris Program. There's a certain amount of, if there's, if industry does any kind of development off the coast, they have to mitigate for unavoidable impacts to the seafloor. They have to pay under the Coastal Act, they have to pay for the damage they're causing to the ocean. And so some of those funds become available for this kind of work. But it's been primarily government grants and both at the state and federal level. And from, at least for our program, everything from the Wildlife Conservation Board to the NOAA Marine Debris Program to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Coastal Commission, mitigation funds. Yeah.
And David, how did your program get started? What was the investment like?
Yes, so we're a benefits corporation in California, so we are for-profit, focused on building products. So predominantly we link funding from our corporate partners. So Patagonia is a our biggest funder. They're focused on pulling recycled material through their supply chain. So we're fortunate to have their backing, but obviously we didn't start there. We had to prove ourselves. So we were fortunate to get small government grants in Chile. They saw the value in starting the program there. For pilot projects in country, we just started in Peru last year. So we haven't actually shipped any material out of Peru. Most of that's been feasibility studies, working with the fishermen. We partnered with WWF on that one, and they received a grant from the U.S. State Department to help get the programs off the ground. We've gotten university grants, relatively small grants in the beginning to get started, and then we ran some crowdfunding ourselves through our products. So we've kind of bootstrapped it together to date, and trying now to create a business out of it where consumers buy products from companies purchase raw material, and then we can work with that, the raw material price to basically to fund the supply chain.
And that's a very hard thing to do, so kudos. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to our panelists for coming out here. So before I forget, join us on June 11th when writer and exhibit developer Paul Erickson will discuss his book, Don't Mess With Me, The Strange Lives of Venomous Creatures. Ooh, fun. So thank you and have a good night.